So we are going to talk today a little bit about what they talked about yesterday in our video. Okay, so we are going to introduce genetics. Again, this is our unit 4, and this is our first foray into actual instruction. All right, cool. So let's go ahead and get started. So today we know that DNA exists, but we don't really know what it does, even though we know it and we know what it does. But what you have to understand is that the ideas of genetic and the ideas of heredity came along a long time before we discovered DNA. To give you a little bit of perspective, um, when I was in high school, there wasn't really like there was this stuff called DNA, and we knew it did something, but we hadn't mapped it, and we didn't know exactly how it was 100% tied um to genetics, but we knew it had something to do with genetics. So that, for me, I mean, I graduated high school 30 years ago. So a lot of this DNA technology has really come along a really long way in the last 30 years. I mean, now you can't find a biology textbook that doesn't mention DNA. Genetics is the branch of biology that studies heredity. So this is one of the things that you need to fill. I'm trying to get two things going over here, and it's really kind of killing me, but that's okay. There we go. I just want to be able to look at the student note catcher at the same time so I can tell you where you're writing. So, again, genetics is the branch of biology that studies heredity. And heredity is this idea that we can pass traits or characteristics from parents to offspring. So, for example, you might have your mom's eye color. You might have your dad's nose shape. Um, you maybe have your, grandpa's height. There are things, characteristics, many times observable, which we can pass from one generation to the next. So from parents to offspring. So, who is Gregor Mendel? So we heard about him yesterday in our video. Gregor Mendel is considered to be the father of genetics. The idea of genetics really did not exist until this guy did his work. Gregor Mendel, he was an Austrian monk, so he was from Austria, and he was born in 1822. His parents were very, very poor, but they did have a background in agriculture. So, just like anybody of the time and even today, um, you basically learn what you're around. So, his parents were agriculturalists, they were probably farmers. And so he was really, really good with plants. He was an expert botanist. For those of you who don't know, a botanist is literally a person who studies plants. And he is referred to as the father of genetics because, again, he was the first one to study patterns of inheritance. Prior to this, it was just kind of like, oh, yeah, you kind of look like your mom, whoop de doo. But nobody really took the time to study that because they just assumed, oh, well, that's just how it is. And there used to be this idea called a blending effect, where they really just thought that, like, literally parts of your parents just would sort of blend together and sort of make the traits of the baby. So let's talk a little bit about Mendel's studies, okay? So he used pea plants to perform his studies. Uh, because again, he was a monk and he lived in a monastery. And for those of you who don't know, oftentimes if you live in those sort of conditions, if you will, they are responsible for growing their own food. So this was one of the things that he could do. He could study botany and also provide food for all of his brothers at the monastery. He kept really, really awesome, detailed records of his pea plants for many, many generations. So that was kind of cool. And he also used statistics. So he basically used math. So for the people that are like, what am I ever going to use math for? Well, back in the 1800s, Mendel was using it to study genetics. Um, and using math, he was able to actually make very, very accurate predictions of the outcomes of his experiments. And this helped to establish new and exciting theories. I want to remind everybody at this point that when we talk about a theory in science, we are not talking about some random guy's thought process. Nope, 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 nope. A theory usually, not usually, is always backed up by hundreds, if not thousands, of experiments and mountains of data. So when we say that we have a theory in science, it is like scientific fact, but we are still adding to it. Other theories that exist in science is the theory of gravity. Nobody seems to, have a problem with gravity, even though it's just a theory. Anyways, I digress. All right, so why pea plants? Besides the fact that like green peas are freaking delicious, and he wanted to feed them to his brothers at the monastery. So why study peas? Um, so here's the deal: the male and female parts of a pea are inside the same flower. So it's really, really, really easy to control mating. I know that this sounds really weird because, we're humans and we tend to be like a little giggly about this kind of stuff. But yes, plants do reproduce sexually. They do have male parts, they have female parts, and just like male parts and female parts in animals, when these parts get together, fertilization happens and an offspring occurs. So the male and female plants for a pea plant are inside of the flower. So it's really easy to control how fertilization happens. Number two, peas are really easy to grow and they grow really fast. Um, in fact, this is one of those plants that if you always like, I know people who want to garden but are no good at gardening, and they kill stuff a lot. Um, Generally speaking, peas is considered to be one of the easier plants to grow if you want to have a food bearing garden. So super easy to grow, and they grow really, really fast. Um, they also produce a lot of offspring. If you've ever seen a pea plant, it's not just one pea pod that shows up. Like one plant will have like lots and lots of pea pods. Lastly, each characteristic of a garden pea or each character of garden peas come in two forms. Um, Either it's one or it's the other. Either they have purple flowers or they have white flowers. There's no pink flowers on peas. Their stems are either very, very long or they are very, very short. There aren't any medium stems on standard peas. So this made it really easy to study these characteristics. I mean, and I'm not saying that it would have been ethical to study humans, but I mean, consider like if you want to study skin tone in humans, like literally people can be like alabaster white all the way to like really, 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 really dark browns and blacks. So like literally it's like a rainbow of skin tones. That's hard to study. But pea plants, easy because everything comes in twos, right? So it's either one or the other. The characteristics that he studied were the flower color. And again, all of these are in twos. So the flower color is either white or purple. The flower position. The flower shows up either on. I will take attendance again at the end of class, but thank you. So the flower position, We say we have axial flowers if the flowers show up um, on like somewhere near the stem of the plant. We have terminal flowers if they show up at the end of the stems. So it's either in the middle or at the end. Seed color. Seeds really only come up in two colors when you have peas. They're either yellow or they're green. There are seed shapes. Again, two forms of that seed shape. We are either round or it is wrinkled. Pod shaped. It either has a full kind of like this top one here is kind of like full and fluffy, or it's constricted where you can actually see the individual peas on the inside. The pod color, just like the seed color, comes in two varieties, yellow or green. And then the stem length. Stem lengths come in two varieties, tall or short. So again, it's really easy to see these. These characteristics are extremely easy to see. Um, and therefore they're easy to study. All right, so Mendel comes up with what we call a monohybrid cross. Mendel's experiment involved many monohybrid crosses. To give you an idea of how many crosses he did, this guy literally gardened almost every single day for 20 years. There's literally like thousands and thousands of these experiments that we actually have data on. So it's actually kind of cool. All right, so let's take a look at some of the language here. Monohybrid. Mono means one. Hybrid means a cross of different traits. So if I have a monohybrid cross, what I am doing is I am crossing or experimenting, crossing two different characteristics for one particular trait. Okay, so what is shown here is a monohybrid cross. And it can be used to examine the distribution of one set of genes during reproduction. So what you see in the picture here is you see a monohybrid cross between a white flower and a purple flower. And as you can see, all of the offspring come out purple. So that was the result of Mendel's monohybrid crosses. So like the white just seemed to sort of disappear when he crossed it, with a purple plant. All right, so to understand how true breeding happens versus self fertilization, we need to kind of understand a little bit about the inside of a flower. So during Mendel's studies, it was really important that he let some of the pea plants self fertilize, and then some of them he purposely crossed. Okay, so inside the pea plant, you have the stamen and the anther, and the anther actually has the pollen on it. These are the stamen, the anther, all of these sort of like stick pieces, if you will. These are considered to be the male portion of the flower. So the anther, the filament, together is the stamen. That is considered to be the male portion of the flower. The pistil, on the other hand, which is this sort of top stigma piece, this style, which almost kind of looks like a tube, and then the ovary on the bottom, that is the female portion of the flower. So what Mendel basically did is if he did not want the plants breeding on their own, what he would do is he would literally go in and cut out the stamens because it's really kind of easy to do. If he wanted them to self fertilize, if he was allowing those plants to just fertilize themselves, he would leave the stamens in. So that's basically how it happened. It was kind of brilliant, actually. All right. So, why is self-fertilization important in Mendel studies? So, in Mendel studies, self-fertilization was performed to determine if the offspring will have the same characteristics as the original parent. Where are we? If all of the hybrid offspring were identical, then the original parent is considered to be a true bred or a purebred or true breeding. There's lots of different words that we use to describe that. If you're at all familiar with dogs, you are familiar with the concept of a purebred, where basically if you have a purebred dog and he mates with another purebred dog, you always get that same kind of dog back. Versus mutts, which kind of like have a little bit of everything in them. If the offsprings were not identical, then the original parent is not a purebred or a true bred or a true breeding plant. So, true breeding plants or purebred plants serve as the parental generation for Mendel studies, or the P generation for short. So, you're going to hear me say P generation quite a bit. Rather than saying parental generation, because it's purely just for easiest. It's easier to do it that way. All right, so here's what Mendel actually did in his experiment. So he would have true bleeding plants, one that was purple and one with white flowers. Okay. Now, again, this could be for long stems and short stems. It could be for any of the characteristics that we discovered that we talked about earlier. It really doesn't matter. What he would do is he would cross. So he actually crossed these two purebred individuals. When he did this, we get the first generation of plants. F stands for filial, and this means son or daughter. So the P generation, the parent generation, creates the F1 generation, or the filial generation. And filial just comes out Greek or Latin, I forget which, and it means son or daughter. Okay, and that kind of makes sense. It sort of looks like a little bit like a like a family tree. And then these guys were allowed to self fertilize. So in other words, they were allowed to just breed themselves. So the P generation, Mendel would cut the stamens out of, and he would keep and he would purposely cross them. The second generation, the F2 generation, was a result of the F1 generation self-fertilizing. And when it did that, we create the F2 generation, or the second filial generation. Okay, so P generation, those are the parents. The parents we know are true breeding or purebreds. And again, that could be for anything. It could be for flower color, pea color, shape, any of those 7 things we talked about earlier. All right, so when he does this experiment, purebred parents creating the first filial generation and allowing the first filial generation to fertilize to create hybrids, what do we actually get? Well, you can see on the bottom here, it says violet and white basically make violet. Like there's no white in the first filial generation. But when the first filial generation is allowed to self fertilize, we get both purple and white flowers, which is kind of weird. Like, where'd the white come back from? And again, it's just about a 3-to-1 ratio if you look at the actual numbers down here. When he did this, again, this is literally thousands of times. Every single time there was a pattern. So if we cross purple and white and the the flower color for these are the parents. By the time we got to the second generation, we had a 3-to-1 ratio, 3 purples to 1 white. When I did this for the flower position, again, axial versus terminal, that would be my parental generation. By the time I got down to the second generation, the F2 generation, I had a ratio of 3.14 to 1. When I did it for seed color, I ended up with a ratio of 3.01 to 1. So, what is the pattern that's emerging here, guys? Anybody? When you get down to the second generation, look at the ratios. I don't know if I can make them any bigger. There we go. What is the pattern that is emerging for every single time he does these crosses? What is the ratio about? Round it. Anybody? Hello? Look at the ratios. What is the ratio, ladies and gentlemen? Which one? The ratio. Read the ratio column and tell me what the ratio is for every single time he did a cross. About like round it so that they are all like. What is the pattern? Somebody put something in the chat. If you can just unmute yourself and talk. I can't really see the chat.
Ms. Michael, is the ratio 3.1?
It's it's pretty much 3-to-1. I mean, I have 3.15 to 1, 3.14 to 1, 3.01 to 1, 2.96, which is pretty much 3-to-1, 2.95, which is pretty much 3-to-1, 2.82, which if I round is 3-to-1, and 2.84, which if I round is 3-to-1. Every yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just got my computer, so I was going to switch over to that computer.
That's okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. So every time he does these crosses, you go from purebred parents. By the time you get down to the second filial generation or the F2 generation, you have a 3-to-1 ratio. And look at these numbers. Like he did seed color literally 8,000 times. He did seed shape, it looks like 7,000 times. He did pod shape about 1,000 times. These aren't like a one-time thing. These are massive numbers. And to always get a 3-to-1 ratio means that there has to be something there. So, here we go. What were the results? In the F1 generation, all the white flowers disappeared. But in the F2 generation, some of them had come back. The ratio, like we just said, in the F2 generation was always 3-to-1. Purple flowers for each white flower. So, how do you explain this? Like, how? Like, what is it? What's going on? What it tells us is that organisms in the F1 generation specifically must carry both forms, but one masks the other. And that is what is important here. What it tells us is that the purple trait for flowers is dominant over the white trait. So dominant well, we'll get to what it actually specifically means in a minute. But in other words, if you have a dominant trait, it masks over the other trait. The reason we know that the organisms in the F1 generation are carrying both traits is because we see white flowers pop back up in the F2 generation. All right, so these carrying both forms, what are they carrying? What they are carrying are alleles. So each characteristic, each gene has two forms. They're called alleles. So one allele is inherited from the egg, and one allele is inherited from the sperm. Now, they're depending on like which species you're talking about, we might call them something else, like in plants or mammals or reptiles. Like there are different names for these alleles. But when a parent makes eggs or sperm, their genes separate. This is the law or the principle of segregation. What this means is that the gamete, so when a parent makes eggs, when a parent makes the sperm, their gamete will contain either one dominant allele or one recessive allele. Okay? Because remember, in order to make offspring, this egg and sperm have to come together and get fertilized. And then now that offspring will have the two alleles again. Because again, every characteristic has a gene in two forms, one you got from mom, one you got from dad. And those forms are called alleles. All right, but then each gamete, each egg or each sperm contain either a dominant allele or a recessive allele. So again, it's kind of like the luck of the draw in terms of which one you end up getting from mom or dad. So, dominant alleles. Dominant alleles are always written as a capital letter. Recessive alleles are always written as a lowercase letter. So let's see what this looks like in terms of our pea plants. So let's take a look at the height of pea plants. Tall pea plants are dominant. Short pea plants are recessive. So if I wanted to show these alleles, I would say T for tall. And again, we're talking about the same characteristic. We're talking about the characteristic of height. So we're not going to change letters. We're going to just use lowercase t for short. And that's a little weird, but that's just how it is. So what are my possible combinations here? Well, I could have, again, each gamete is only going to carry one letter, either tall or short from mom or dad. So I might get two dominant alleles, two recessive alleles, or one of each. So this individual here with the two capital T's, is this individual going to be tall or are they going to be short? If I have two alleles for tall, am I going to be tall or am I going to be short if I'm a pea plant? Anybody? You will be tall because the only genes you have are tall genes. You only have tall alleles. So that characteristic that you are going to show will be for tallness. All right, let's look at this middle one. All right, we have two short alleles. What is this person going to be? Or this pea plant, excuse me. We're talking about pea plants, not people. So the pea plant here in the middle with two little t's. Is that plant going to be tall or is it going to be short?
Short.
Short. Perfect. Yeah, because the only alleles that it has for this particular characteristic are short alleles. Awesome. So, by the way, these would be like the purebreds, right? These would be like the plants that we started off with originally. They only have one type of allele. Now, again, I got the big T from the egg, and I got the big T from the sperm. So when they got together, that makes the individual. Same thing here. Little little. These first two are considered to be purebreds, or they are considered to be true breeding. In other words, they only carry one type of allele. All right, so let's take a look at this last dude right here, this last little pea plant. They inherited one tall allele and one short allele. Is that last plant going to be tall or is it going to be short? It will be tall. Can you tell me your reasoning why?
Tall is the dominant allele.
Perfect. Tall is dominant. And I want to hug you. Tall is dominant. And what that means is dominant alleles are always expressed. If there's a dominant allele present, that's going to be the one you see. That's going to be the one that expresses itself. The only time you can see a recessive allele, the only time you see a recessive trait, is if it is a purebred. This is just like when you crossed them earlier and then they said, oh, the white flowers disappeared. They didn't disappear. All the genes were still there. They were just being masked over. They were being hidden by the dominant allele. That was brilliant. All right, we are going to leave it. I think this is the actual end of the notes. Oh my God, for like once in our life, we finished the notes on time. Woohoo, go us. All right, ladies and gentlemen, if you did not get through all of your notes, I will be posting the video for the notes just as soon as it renders. So please do make sure you check back for that. Other than that, it is that time to go. If you know